In the year 312 after Christ, a Roman engineer stood on the Via Appia, the queen of roads, and marveled at what his ancestors had built. Stretching from Rome to the southern port of Brundisium, this road had carried legions to war, merchants to market, and messages across the empire for over 5 centuries. The stones were still perfectly fitted. The drainage still worked. You could ride a chariot from one end to the other at full speed without hitting a single pothole. 2 centuries later, in 520, another man stood on the same road. But now, the stones were cracked and missing, drainage channels were clogged with debris, sections had collapsed entirely, forcing travelers onto muddy detours. Bandits lurked where legions once marched. The road that had symbolized Roman power was crumbling, and no one was coming to fix it. The empire hadn't been invaded yet. Rome still had emperors, armies, and tax collectors. But the infrastructure that made Rome function, that allowed it to move troops, collect taxes, feed cities, and project power, was dying. And when infrastructure dies, empires follow. This is the 7-stage pattern of infrastructure collapse. It has destroyed every major civilization that forgot a simple truth. Maintenance is not optional. And right now, in 2025, the United States is in stage 6, the stage where resilience disappears, and small failures cascade into catastrophic ones. The Roman roads didn't just crumble by accident. They followed a pattern. And America is following the same pattern, step by step, toward the same end. Stage 1 is always the same, the golden age of infrastructure, built on debt. When Rome was expanding, when its legions were conquering new territories and wealth was flooding in, the Republic made a decision that would define the next 1,000 years. They would build roads, not dirt paths, but engineered marvels of stone, drainage, and precision that would last centuries. The Via Appia, begun in 312 before Christ, was just the start. Over the next few centuries, Rome built over 250,000 miles of roads connecting every corner of the empire. These weren't just military highways, they were economic arteries. Goods flowed from Egypt to Britannia. Taxes collected in Gaul reached Rome in weeks instead of months. Messages traveled at speeds that wouldn't be matched again until the telegraph. The roads made the empire possible. Without them, Rome's armies couldn't have moved quickly enough to defend borders. Trade would have been too slow and expensive. The system of taxation and administration that funded everything would have collapsed under its own logistics. But here's what history often glosses over. Rome didn't pay for these roads with surplus wealth. They borrowed. They financed infrastructure through debt, taxation of conquered territories, and deferred costs. The roads were an investment in future dominance, paid for by future generations, and it worked brilliantly. The return on investment was enormous. The roads enabled conquest, which brought wealth, which paid for more roads. It was a virtuous cycle, as long as the expansion continued. The United States followed the exact same playbook in the 20th century. After World War II, America embarked on the largest infrastructure project in human history, the interstate highway system. Begun under President Eisenhower in 1956, it would eventually span over 48,000 miles, connecting every major city in the country. The economic impact was staggering. Travel times collapsed. Shipping costs plummeted. Suburbs exploded, creating a construction boom that lasted decades. The interstate system enabled the rise of Walmart, Amazon, and just-in-time manufacturing. It made the American economy the most efficient in the world. But just like Rome, America paid for it with debt. The federal government borrowed billions, eventually trillions when you account for all the related projects: bridges, airports, ports, power grids, water systems. The infrastructure was built on the assumption that future growth would pay for it, and just like Rome, it worked for a while. Stage 1 creates the foundation of empire, but Stage 2 is where the problems begin: diversion of capital. Infrastructure has a basic, unglamorous requirement: maintenance. Roads wear down, bridges develop cracks, pipes corrode, power grids age. Maintenance isn't exciting. It doesn't win elections or make headlines. It's just a constant, necessary cost. And empires always defer it. In Rome's case, the diversion started when expansion stopped. By the 2nd century after Christ, Rome had conquered most of the territory it could effectively control. The flow of plunder and tribute slowed, but the costs of empire didn't. The army still needed to be paid. The borders still needed defending. And Roman citizens, especially in the capital, demanded bread and circuses, free grain and entertainment to keep them pacified. So when the Senate, and later the emperors, looked at the budget, they had a choice: maintain roads in distant provinces that no one in Rome saw, or fund the legions and keep the population happy. They chose the legions and the circuses. Every time. The roads? Those could wait. They'd been standing for centuries. Surely they'd last a bit longer. America made the same choice, just with different vocabulary. After the interstate system was built, maintenance should have been the priority. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimated in the 1980s that regular upkeep and timely repairs would cost a fraction of what major reconstruction would cost later. But maintenance didn't happen. Why? Because the money was diverted to two politically irresistible categories: foreign military spending and expanding social programs. The United States, after winning the Cold War, didn't scale back its military. Instead, it expanded, taking on the role of global policeman, bases in over 80 countries. Carrier groups patrolling every ocean. Wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless smaller interventions. The bill ran into trillions. At the same time, social spending exploded. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and dozens of other programs expanded to serve a growing and aging population. These programs are politically untouchable. Any attempt to reform them is electoral suicide. So when budget time came, politicians faced the same choice as Rome: fix a bridge in Pennsylvania that might last another decade, or fund the military and social programs that voters and special interests demand. They chose the military and the programs, every time. And the roads, the bridges, the water systems, those could wait. This brings us to stage 3, bureaucratic bloat and corruption. Even when money is allocated for infrastructure, it doesn't go where it should. Because over time, the process of building and maintaining infrastructure becomes captured by bureaucracy and corruption. In Rome, by the 4th and 5th centuries, the administrative apparatus had become so bloated and inefficient that even when emperors wanted to repair roads, the money disappeared into layers of officials, contractors, and middlemen. Road repair that should have cost 1,000 gold solidi somehow cost 10,000, with most of the money vanishing into pockets along the way. Provincial governors skimmed, army officers embezzled, contractors used cheap materials and pocketed the difference. And by the time anyone noticed, the officials responsible had retired or moved on. The system had become a machine for extracting money, not for building anything. America's version is cleaner, legalized, but functionally identical. It's called honest graft, the art of profiting from public projects without technically breaking the law. Here's how it works. A bridge needs repair. The federal government allocates funding, but the money flows through state departments of transportation, environmental review boards, labor unions with prevailing wage requirements, contractors with political connections, and subcontractors who all take their cut. The permitting process alone can take years. Environmental impact studies, community input sessions, compliance with dozens of federal regulations. Every delay adds cost. When construction finally begins, the project is inevitably over budget and behind schedule. A bridge repair that should cost $10 million and take 2 years somehow costs $100 million and takes a decade. Where does the money go? Consulting fees, legal fees, compliance costs, inflated labor contracts, materials marked up through connected suppliers. It's not illegal. It's just the system. And because the system is so expensive and slow, even when funding is available, far less actually gets built or repaired than the public thinks. The result is stage 4, economic slowdown through infrastructure decay. Here's what most people don't understand about infrastructure. It's not just about having roads and bridges. It's about the speed and reliability of commerce. When infrastructure is excellent, goods move fast and cheap. When it decays, everything slows down and costs more. In Rome, as roads deteriorated, the effects rippled through the economy. Merchants had to use slower, more expensive routes. Transport times doubled or tripled. Goods spoiled in transit. Trade became less profitable, so less trade happened. Regional economies that had been integrated began to fragment and localize. This created a form of silent inflation. Even if the currency was stable, the real cost of goods rose because logistics became more expensive. A farmer in Gaul might produce the same amount of grain, but getting it to market in Rome cost more, took longer, and was less reliable. So, prices rose, or the farmer stopped bothering to produce a surplus for export. The economic dynamism that roads had created reversed. The empire became poorer, not because of conquest or taxation, but because the physical system that enabled prosperity was breaking down. America is experiencing the same process right now. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives U.S. infrastructure a C- grade. That's not a political opinion, it's an assessment of physical reality. Bridges are structurally deficient. Roads are full of potholes, increasing vehicle wear and fuel consumption. Ports are congested, unable to handle modern shipping volumes efficiently. The power grid is aging and unreliable, leading to brownouts and blackouts. Water systems are contaminated with lead and collapsing pipes. Every one of these failures has an economic cost. A truck driver who has to slow down or detour around a broken bridge takes longer to deliver goods. That's a cost passed to consumers. A factory that suffers from unreliable power has to keep backup generators, capital that could have been invested productively. A 2021 study estimated that infrastructure deficiencies cost the average American household over $3,000 per year in increased costs, wasted time, and reduced productivity. Nationally, the cost runs into hundreds of billions annually, a silent tax on the entire economy. And just like Rome, this decay creates fragmentation. Supply chains that were once seamless now have bottlenecks and failures. Regional economies that should be integrated are held back by logistics costs. The efficiency that made America dominant is eroding. Which brings us to stage 5, the emergency bond, borrowing from the future to fix the past. At some point, the decay becomes visible and politically unavoidable. A bridge collapses, killing commuters. A dam fails, flooding a town. A blackout cripples a city. The public demands action, and politicians, facing re-election, have to respond. But by now, the costs of repair have exploded, because infrastructure that was merely aging 10 years ago is now critically failing, and emergency repairs cost far more than routine maintenance. Rome tried this repeatedly in the late Empire. Emperors would issue emergency decrees, raise special taxes, or borrow from wealthy senators to fund crash programs to rebuild key roads or fortifications. But it was always too little, too late, and far too expensive. The money raised barely scratched the surface of what was needed. And because the underlying problems, diversion of funds, bureaucratic waste, economic decline, hadn't been solved, the new infrastructure started deteriorating immediately. America is in this stage right now. In 2021, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a $1.2 trillion package to rebuild roads, bridges, broadband, and more. It was celebrated as a historic investment, but here's the reality. $1.2 trillion sounds enormous, but the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that America has an infrastructure funding gap of over $2.6 trillion over the next decade. The bill doesn't even close half the gap. And that's if the money is spent efficiently, which, as we've seen in Stage 3, it won't be. Much of it will be absorbed by bureaucracy, waste, and inflation. Moreover, this infrastructure spending is being financed by debt. The federal government doesn't have $1.2 trillion sitting around. It's borrowing it, adding to a national debt that already exceeds $30 trillion. Future generations will be paying interest on loans taken out to fix problems that should have been addressed decades ago. This is the trap. By the time action is taken, the only option is to borrow massively, saddle the future with debt, and still not solve the underlying problem. It's a crisis deferred, not averted. And that leads to Stage 6, where America is right now. Loss of resilience. This is the most dangerous stage, the one that precedes final collapse. The infrastructure still functions, most of the time. Bridges haven't all fallen down.
The power grid usually works. Water mostly flows from taps.
On the surface, everything looks fine. But the system has lost its redundancy, its ability to absorb shocks. Everything is running at maximum capacity with no backup, no margin for error. And when a failure happens, it cascades. In Rome, this stage was visible by the 5th century. The road network was so degraded that a single broken bridge or washed-out section could cut off entire regions. Supply chains depended on specific, fragile routes. When those routes failed, through decay, bandit attacks, or Gothic raids, cities starved. Armies couldn't be reinforced, and local regions were left to fend for themselves. The empire had become brittle. It looked intact on maps, but in reality, it was a shattered mosaic, held together by inertia. America is in the same position. Consider a few examples. In 2021, a cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline, a single pipeline that carries 45% of the East Coast's fuel supply, caused gas shortages and panic buying across multiple states. One pipeline, one attack, regional crisis. In 2021, the Suez Canal was blocked for 6 days by a single container ship running aground. Global trade routes were disrupted. Hundreds of ships were delayed. Costs ran into billions. One ship, one canal. Global impact. The Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore collapsed after being struck by a cargo ship. The Port of Baltimore, one of the largest on the East Coast, was shut down for months. Supply chains were rerouted. Costs mounted. One bridge, one accident. Economic damage across the country. In Texas, in 2021, a winter storm caused the power grid to fail. Millions were without electricity and heat for days. People froze to death in their homes. The grid wasn't built with redundancy for extreme weather, so when it failed, there was no backup. These are not freak accidents. They're symptoms of a system with no resilience. America's infrastructure is optimized for efficiency in normal times, but it has no capacity to handle disruptions. There are no alternate routes, no backup systems, no redundancy. And as the infrastructure continues to age and decay, these cascade failures will become more frequent and more severe. A blackout in one region triggers failures in another. A port closure reroutes traffic to ports that can't handle the volume. A bridge collapse forces trucks onto roads not designed for heavy loads, accelerating their decay. This is Stage 6. The system still works until suddenly it doesn't. And when it fails, the damage is no longer local. It's systemic. The final stage, Stage 7, is military and supply chain failure. Rome reached this stage in the 5th century. The roads that had once moved legions quickly across the empire were now impassable in many regions. When barbarian tribes invaded, Roman armies couldn't respond fast enough. When they did arrive, they couldn't be supplied because the logistics network had collapsed. Cities under siege couldn't be relieved. Frontier forts were abandoned because reinforcements never came. And when the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, it wasn't because they had a superior military. It was because Rome could no longer muster the infrastructure to defend itself. The empire didn't fall to a single battle or invasion. It slowly lost the ability to function, and infrastructure collapse was at the heart of that failure. America is not at stage 7, yet. The U.S. military is still the most powerful in the world, and supply chains, though strained, still function. But the warning signs are visible. During the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain failures exposed how fragile this system had become. Ports couldn't process the volume of ships arriving. Trucking companies couldn't find drivers or afford fuel. Warehouses were full, but goods couldn't reach stores. Shortages of basic items, from toilet paper to semiconductors, revealed a just-in-time system with no resilience. The military, too, is starting to feel the strain. The Pentagon has warned that aging infrastructure at bases, runways, docks, power systems, is becoming a readiness issue. If the U.S. had to mobilize for a major conflict, could the infrastructure handle it? Could ports load and move equipment fast enough? Could the rail system transport military hardware across the country? Right now, the answer is probably yes. But the gap between capability and requirement is shrinking, and if America reaches stage 7, where the infrastructure can no longer reliably support military logistics or guarantee basic supply chains, the empire is finished. So, how does this end? The Roman example is instructive. By the late 5th century, Rome could no longer afford to maintain the roads. The tax base had collapsed due to economic decline. The military consumed whatever resources remained, and so the roads, the physical embodiment of Roman power, were simply abandoned. Local populations scavenged the stones for building materials. Sections were buried under dirt and vegetation. The network fragmented into local paths, and within a few generations, the knowledge of how to build roads like that was lost entirely. Medieval Europe wouldn't see road engineering on that scale again for 1,000 years. For Rome, infrastructure collapse was both symptom and cause of imperial decline. It was a symptom of economic and political failure, but it also accelerated the collapse by making the empire too expensive and slow to function. America is not Rome. The technologies are different, the scale is different, the timeline is different. But the pattern is the same. The infrastructure that made American dominance possible, the interstate system, the power grid, the ports, the water systems, was built on debt in a moment of expansion. As growth slowed, maintenance was deferred in favor of military spending and social programs. Bureaucracy and corruption made repairs expensive and slow. Economic costs mounted as the infrastructure decayed. Emergency spending came too late and only deepened the debt. And now, the system has lost resilience, sitting at stage 6, where small failures cascade into large crises. Stage 7, military and supply chain failure, is not inevitable, but every year that passes without serious reform makes it more likely. Here's the brutal truth that no politician wants to say. Fixing America's infrastructure would require trillions of dollars and decades of sustained focus. It would require cutting other spending, military or social programs, to prioritize maintenance. It would require reforming the bureaucratic and regulatory systems that make infrastructure so expensive. It would require political courage to make unpopular decisions for long-term benefit. None of that is happening. Instead, the pattern continues. Defer maintenance, divert funds, let the infrastructure decay, borrow for emergency fixes, lose resilience, and inch closer to the final stage. The Roman roads didn't collapse in a single moment. They decayed over decades, ignored by leaders who had more pressing concerns, until the day when armies couldn't march, Goods couldn't move, and the empire discovered it no longer had the physical capacity to function. America's infrastructure is following the same path. The interstate system, once the envy of the world, is aging and crumbling.
The power grid is fragile. The water systems are failing.
And every small collapse, every bridge failure, every blackout, every supply chain disruption is a warning that the system is in stage 6, where resilience is gone and catastrophic failure is one shock away. The Roman engineers who built the Via Appia believed they were building for eternity, and in a sense they were right. Parts of that road still exist today, 2,000 years later. But the empire that built it is gone, in part because it forgot that even eternal stone requires maintenance.
America's infrastructure won't last 2,000 years. At the current rate, it might not last 50. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The patterns are carved in stone. You just have to read them before the road runs out.